Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of Ben All of America Audio. We've got a very interesting guest here this week. He is Charles Upton, the author of Cracks in the Great Wall, UFOs and Traditional Metaphysics, and he has got a fascinating perspective on UFOs that really hasn't been talked about much or hasn't really been discussed recently in the UFO world. It's definitely an outsider's perspective on what's going on here with the UFO phenomenon, and a wholly unique look at who may be behind the UFOs. Frightening perspective on UFOs, and I'm really excited and interested in talking to him about his research into the cracks in the Great Wall, if you will. Of course, that's the title of the book, Cracks in the Great Wall. Charles Upton, welcome to Ben All of America Audio.
Well, glad to be here, and research, you might call it. I mean, basically, I'm not an investigative reporter or a ufologist. I'm just trying to make sense of what has already been discovered by other people, and at least, the things I accept that have been discovered by other people, trying to put it into a single paradigm or a single picture that isn't so terribly contradictory.
So you're more of an observer trying to put together a unified field, I guess you could say.
Yeah, unified field, unified theory, let's say that.
There you go. Well, let's start out with the bio, the background. Who is Charles Upton, and how did you become interested in the UFO subject?
Well, I mean, essentially, I'm of the age, just about to be 60 years old, where I was in the center of the counterculture of the 60s, and that's one of the myths that was floating around. If anybody remembers Captain Beefheart, they will remember, the blimp, the mothership, which was a satire of that. But, this is one of the many things that came more deeply into mass consciousness through the hippie era, and it was picked up more and sort of formalized more as the New Age began to take over from the hippies, and then you got a lot of UFO groups like the Pleiadians and such who believed they were in touch with these beings. Mm-hmm. So it was just part of my cultural upbringing, and it's one of the things I wanted to make sense of. And so who am I? Well, I was a San Francisco poet back in the 60s and 70s. It was published by Lawrence Ferlinghetti of City Lights Books, if anybody remembers those guys. They did Allen Ginsberg and those people. So I sort of knew the Beat Generation people, and then went through the counterculture. Basically I've been investigating religion. I went through New Age for a couple of years. I spent a couple of years doing solidarity work with Central American refugees through the Sanctuary movement when I was with my wife and I were with a Episcopal, I should bite my tongue, Presbyterian church. And so, I've been looking around religion here and there, and for most of my life. After that, I joined a Persian Sufi order, which is active in the West, and still connected with the Sufi path. So that's what I'm doing spiritually. But somehow, one of the aspects of my spiritual worldview has to be those things which menace the truth, and then menace the truth both in terms of disinformation and in terms of trying to establish non-religious or even demonic worldviews so as to take the place of the revealed religions. And this is something I pretty much stand against. And so that's part of what I feel my role is. And lastly, I would say that through my wife, Jenny, mostly in the 80s, I started to read the books of the traditionalist school, who are the names that people may recognize are Ananda Kumaraswamy, Fritjof Schuon, and René Guénon, and there's a bunch of others. And they sort of presented a very high-level, very integrated metaphysics, were drawn from the world religions and, the great metaphysical sages throughout history like Plato and Plotinus and Shankara and such. Mm-hmm. But, a body of doctrine which I could sort of sit with, which I could stand upon, and from that point of view start to look at other manifestations of belief systems of this and that kind and have something to measure them against. So I say that one of the genres of books that I write I call metaphysics and social criticism, using a metaphysical paradigm to do essentially social criticism. Our other paradigms are sort of worn out. Marxism is gone, and liberal ideology is gone. The neocons don't have an ideology; they just have an agenda. And so, it got very hard to have an overview of what's going on in the world because the theories we use to look at it with are all called into question. So I decided to go back to metaphysics, which deals with eternal principles, and see what kind of social criticism could be done on that basis. So, and my book about UFOs is sort of part of that.
Now, I guess before we jump into what your general thesis is with regards to UFOs, give a little sort of thumbnail look at metaphysics for people who are out of the loop and not really familiar with what metaphysics are.
Okay, well, metaphysics, you know, a lot of people when they hear that word, they think, well, that's belief in UFOs, isn't that? Or that's, you know, UFOs, crystals, witchcraft, occultism, you know, psychic phenomena, psychic powers, things like this. Actually, that's not it. Metaphysics may give you a view of what all that stuff is, but that isn't what metaphysics is. Metaphysics is essentially the science of first principles, and you'd call it spiritual or mystical philosophy. And, you know, the big names that people have heard of are Plato, Aristotle, and, you know, in China, Lao Tzu, and, you know, who wrote the Tao Te Ching. And basically, people who look at this universe as emanating from an absolute truth, which in our English language is called God, and all the implications of that fact, the relationship of God to his universe, and in terms of eternal principles that do not change.
Let's dive in here now to Cracks in the Great Wall. Before we started the interview, you said you kind of had it already laid out that you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, well, I've got a page and a half here, and first, though, I'd just like to say a couple of words about what that title means. The metaphysician René Guénon, who passed away, I think, in 1950, had a wonderful book that everybody should read called The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times. And it's a really prophetic book. And in that book, one of the things he said, now he believes that we're getting near the end of this cycle of manifestation or of this particular world. Exactly when this world may end is something, according to the Bible, we're not supposed to really ask. But there are plenty of signs that we're at least in the last phases of this cycle. Mm-hmm. So he says one of the things that happens at the end of a cycle like this is what he calls cracks in the Great Wall. And this simply means that the barrier, let us call it an energy barrier between regular physical reality and subtle realities, you know, the world of the spooks, let's put it that way. This wall wears thin. And as it wears thin, more and more incursions arrive from what he calls the infra-psychic, which is basically, if you've been paying attention to popular culture over the past, 20 years, you'll see that it's changed immensely. And now we're in what I call a permanent Halloween, in which you can't do a television series or a movie unless it has, robots, demons, alien abductions, or something wacko. I mean, we can't do a regular story of human beings anymore because we're not into it. Human beings are passé, And so, if you just, step back and look at this flood of demonic images coming through the mass media and basically going through all our heads, you'll see that something has radically changed from the time when you could have a story about human beings living. We're just my wife and I are just renting old videos of the Waltons. The Waltons, it's a pretty good series, but you couldn't have anything like that now. The Waltons, where's the UFOs? Where's the, where's the witch who turns up at their house? It's only about human beings, just having kids and trying to keep body and soul together and make enough money to live on. And how could that be interesting? Mm-hmm. Well, so our culture's changed immensely, and I think that is a signal, a sign of exactly what Guénon was talking about, is breakthrough of infrapsychic forces. And one of the more radical manifestations of this breakthrough is the UFO phenomenon. So that's what the title is. Now I can read this thing called What UFOs Are, and it's about a page and a half, and this encapsulates my basic theory about the phenomenon.
Okay, that sounds good, because then I have a lot of specific questions about the book that we'll get into, but we want to lay the groundwork here, so let's do that.
Yeah, and I want to say, I'm starting off from the findings of Jacques Vallée, who I feel is probably the best of the ufologists, because he's covered more ground than anybody else. He's talked about all of the aspects of the phenomenon that I can imagine, but he hasn't narrowed his focus in order to explain it one way or the other. So it goes like this. Jacques Vallée, in his numerous books, soundly documents three different aspects of the UFO ET phenomenon. One, it has a real physical component. UFOs leave physical traces appear on radar. Two, it has an undeniable psychic component, lost time periods, altered states of consciousness, alien-human telepathy, ETs appearing in dream or trance states, etc. Three, there is much solid evidence for human deception activities of the Mission Impossible variety surrounding the UFO phenomenon. The following explanation synthesizes these three aspects into a coherent whole. I just want to say, this is the problem in ufology, because it really does have a physical component, a psychic component, and a deception component. Mm-hmm. And people simply cannot make sense of that. You know, they look at all three and they become mesmerized and stunned, and they will opt for one or the other. There are people who say it's all black operations, all black ops. Other people say, no, it's got to be real extraterrestrials. Other people say, you know, it's angels and they're talking to me. Very rarely do you have those three aspects come together. This is what I'm trying to do, is to bring them together.
Okay.
So I say, the outer explanation of the UFO phenomenon and the human activity surrounding it is as follows. The phenomenon is real and largely inexplicable according to conventional science, though theories abound. In view of this, national governments, or cabals within them, or various extra-governmental power blocks have said to themselves, if we can't explain or control the UFO phenomenon, we can at least use it to our benefit. Consequently, they have been playing a game with the public of issuing both official denials that the phenomenon exists, or is inexplicable, or is in any way significant, while at the same time planting spurious evidence that suggests it is all too real, evidence to which are attached various beliefs that they wish to foster. In particular, they want to disseminate the belief that national governments know a great deal about the phenomenon and what's behind it, and that such governments are in fact in ongoing contact with intelligent extraterrestrial beings, but must officially deny this in order to prevent mass panic. Now, Edgar Mitchell recently alluded to his belief that the governments were in touch with extraterrestrials on an ongoing basis. So, in other words, the actual disinformation being disseminated is not the alleged massive government cover-up, which in practical terms would be almost impossible to pull off, but rather the highly successful attempt by some group or groups to make the population believe that a massive government cover-up exists, a much easier task. Mm-hmm. One of the methods being employed is illustrated by the following anecdote. I forget where I heard this, but this is one of the stories that are out there. So I can't attest to this, individually, but this is the way this thing could be being done. The story goes like this. Someone admitted to an American Air Force base catches a glimpse of an object resembling a UFO through an open hangar door. As soon as he sees it, the door is closed, and he's told, you weren't supposed to see that. Then a few days later, the proverbial men in black arrive at his house, threatening reprisals if he ever tells anyone what he saw. This is a classic case of psychological manipulation, where an event that might have made little impression on him suddenly, through the use of terror, assumes the status of a dark revelation. If these people are desperate enough to threaten to harm me or my family if I reveal what I know, then what I saw must be real.
Yeah.
The effect of this project is threefold. One, it protects the national governments from being called upon to actually produce the alien diplomats they are supposedly in contact with. Two, it lends such governments an aura of preternatural power and terror, since they appear to have as allies highly advanced beings from the beyond, who certainly do not rule by the will of the people. Three, by fostering the mass belief in alien contact, it acts to break down traditional paradigms of reality, including religious worldviews, in order to make the imposition of a one-world government and possibly a one-world religion easier to swallow. Okay, that's the outer aspect, but I claim that there's also an inner aspect to the phenomenon. It goes like this. Furthermore, the UFO phenomenon and the human activities surrounding it have an inner explanation as well. Certain individuals and groups within national governments and or the intelligence community and or various extra-governmental power blocks actually are in touch with extraterrestrial intelligences, but in a much different way than they wish the public to believe. These intelligences are in fact demons, and those in touch with them, black magicians. A case in point, both L. Ron Hubbard and Jack Parsons were followers of black magician Aleister Crowley. Hubbard later founded the Church of Scientology, and Parsons, who, according to Jacques Vallée's Messengers of Deception, claimed to have met a Venusian extraterrestrial in the Mojave Desert, went on to co-found both the Aerojet Corporation and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Many, if not most, of the various UFO-related phenomena known to researchers and contactees, the sightings, the landings, the abductions, are actually demonic manifestations. See Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future by Seraphim Rose for the close parallels between the UFO phenomenon and traditional Christian accounts of demonic activity. What, to the exoteric social engineers, are deception activities designed to alter mass belief, to the esoteric magicians, the metaphysicists, are acts of demonic invocation. The mass belief in extraterrestrials and the mass suggestion programs that foster this belief, and as soon as I say that, Steven Spielberg comes immediately to mind, the mass belief in extraterrestrials, etc., actually aid these awliya al-shaitan, an Islamic term meaning Satan's friends, connoting Satan's saints or Satan's contemplatives, in their attempt to contact these entities and release their baleful influence upon an unsuspecting world.
Okay. Is that that's the page and a half, right?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. So essentially what you're saying is there's a sort of a twofold cover-up, if you will. First, there's one perpetrated by the government to make people think that they know more about UFOs than they do.
Or by, I wouldn't say the government as if it were a single entity, but by certain
rogue factions, let's say.
Rogue factions, they may be parts of the government, they may not. They probably are, but I don't know who they are. But you can't say it's by an act of Congress, you know.
Sure.
Some people involved in the government, the intelligence community.
Okay, and then within that, there's also a cabal that you think is in contact with these beings and sort of doing their bidding, and that the beings are demonic, right? That's sort of the gist of what you just read.
Yeah, if you want a good fictional presentation of that, everybody should read That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis. I mean, it was great that the Chronicles of Narnia came out as a movie. Wait till that comes out. It's actually a man I know in the traditionalist school, James Cutzinger, described that as the reign of quantity, which you remember is René Guénon's masterpiece, in fictional form.
The first real question is, why do you ascribe these beings as demonic? I mean, it's always sort of the idea that the UFO phenomenon is so ephemeral that it sort of depends on the person's point of view. Some people might think it's an angel. Some people might think it's, some kind of middling creature, a fairy or a troll or something.
I would say that the middling creatures are also in evidence. I mean, you cannot literally say that all of UFO manifestations are demonic. I'm saying they have a big demonic element, and if anybody's read the John Mack's book, Abduction, talking about the horrendous experiences that people have with UFO abductions or ET abductions, whatever you want to call them, that's enough to show that there's a great demonic component in this phenomenon. Even though Mack didn't care, he just thought it was interesting and weird. All
right, well, let's talk about the hierarchy of being, because that seems to be something that you use as a template, if you will, in looking at your work.
Yeah, well, actually, this is a universal view of reality, which we could probably, if we knew where to look, we could find it in almost every, if not every, religion and mythology and primitive belief system all throughout human history. It existed in fairly good form until, let's say, the 18th century, where that's when the name, the Great Chain of Being, was given to it by certain writers. Essentially, that there's a chain of worlds stretching from this material world to the world of the divine. And nowadays, that's even people who believe in God will tend to look at reality sort of flat as historical and natural alone, and then they will add God to that. But they get very nervous about the idea of higher worlds, higher planes of being, particularly higher worlds of form, where it isn't all just, undifferentiated light, but where you can go to actually other worlds that are not like this world, but have some similarities because they're composed of form, and they have events, and they have beings. one of those worlds is what's always been called fairyland, or the land of the ever young. The Russians call it Belovodia.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably what the Tibetans call Shambhala, and it's a world that is subtler than this. It has it's material in a sense because it has the beings in it, and the objects have a certain substantiality, but it's much subtler than this world. And if you want to go to Plato, essentially Plato talked about the one, or the good, which is what we would call God. Then below that, the intelligible world, which is the world of eternal ideas. And when that concept of Plato got to Islam, particularly Iranian Islam, it was reinterpreted as the world of, let's say, the archangels, where those ideas were also beings. But these are realities that can be reached directly through, direct intellection, which means the faculty that understands truth directly, just like the eye sees light. You know those truths. Okay. There they are. But they're not in form, or they're not in sensual form, at least. Then you get a little farther down, and you get to what's called the intermediary plane, which Plato did not emphasize, but which is in evidence in a lot of his writings. And this is where those ideas appear more as individual beings in their own environment, with their own even histories, one might say, or their own nature, one might say. But it's all in a subtler quality than material reality. Then below that is, let us say, the sensual reality that we call material, what our five senses report, which is, and each one of these worlds is smaller, you might say, less capacious, less transparent to the light of truth than the worlds above. And every one of the worlds above contains all the worlds that are below it. So what you have is a projection into a more and more particular and sort of limited version of reality, and we're in one of the lower worlds as we are walking around in our bodies in this world. But everyone can experience this through, let us say, the dream state. The dream state is the intermediary or the imaginal plane, pretty much. Everybody thinks of dreams as entirely subjective, something going on in your head. But I was once connected with a group of people who were doing something called group dreaming, where they would make dates to rendezvous at a particular place in that world on a particular night. There's a lady called Barbara Shore who has since passed on. She developed something called the octagonal room, where her friends in the group dreaming world would meet, and they would go to this place, and they would see the same thing. They'd wake up the next day and phone each other and say, "Did you see that giraffe over in the corner?" "Oh yeah, I saw that."
Oh,
so in other words, they were validating that the world of dreams, or the imaginal plane, or the intermediary plane, has an objective reality. So actually, okay, that's the world of dreams. Let's put it this way. What you see through your eyes and touch with your hands is the material plane. If you close your eyes and imagine any image whatsoever, that is, let's say, the intermediary plane. But there's a plane directly between those two, which some people call the etheric plane. And if you can imagine something which is more material than a mental image, but more subtle than what's coming in through your five senses,
okay,
that's a particular plane. And that is, I believe, where the UFO beings exist. They're the beings that Muslims call the jinn, the genies, and they're the same beings as the Irish will call, or the French will call, the fairies, or the Shi. And they've been in evidence throughout human history, that they're well known and well attested. And they can come through into this world up to a point, and they can materialize, and they can, have material effects, but they can't really stay here very long, because they're like fish out of water. This is not where they belong. They're more subtle than this. It apparently takes a lot of energy for them to manifest in this world, and that's why you don't have lots of crashed UFOs.
Yeah.
Because, the objects that they appear in, or, that they manifest in this world are ephemeral. That they come in and then they dissolve again in most cases, because it takes too much energy to to maintain them in this form. And if you ever go on YouTube and look at all the UFO videos that people have now,
yeah,
some of which look to me to be deceptions, but a lot of them seem to be just people saw some strange light and had their camera and photographed it. You'll see many of these objects look like they're having a hard time maintaining a particular shape. Some of them do, but a lot of them just change shape all the time as if they are trying to appear as a material object so people will believe that's what they are, but not doing too well. Because, it does take a lot of energy for beings from that world to come to this world.
Okay, and so you're trying to say really like that these beings exist within that middle realm, if you will, that you were just talking about, and that some can be evil and some can be good. Would you classify the angels in this situation, or are they in a different
The angels are actually, I would say, from a higher plane than that.
Okay.
One of the marks of the intermediary plane, or particularly the etheric plane, which is like the lower level, the intermediary plane, very close to the material, is the quality of pixie dust. If you, this depends upon, whether you have the kind of nervous system that is susceptible to such experiences. But some people will know what I mean. The quality where things seem to sparkle, and many little sparkling particles. Whereas the angels come from a realm which is, when they appear in this realm, they're much more solid, and they have a quality of solidified light.
Okay.
So this is just very impressionistic, and if people have never had experiences like this, just don't worry about it. But some people will understand what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Now, in the book, you do a pretty thorough job, sort of looking at time travel and reincarnation and kind of debunking them. So I guess let's talk about that a little bit, because you don't seem to be a fan of those two concepts.
Well, as a follower up to a point of René Guénon, he denied, and this may or may not be historically correct, but he said the real teachings of Buddhism and Hinduism deny reincarnation. Well, that may be going a bit far, but there is a concept in Advaita Vedanta, which is sort of the higher Hindu mysticism. It says God, or the Absolute, or Brahman, is the one and only transmigrant. In other words, the only being who moves from lifetime to lifetime, from body to body, is the Absolute. Which is sort of strange, because how can the Absolute move from thing to thing? The Absolute is everywhere, is perfectly itself.
Yeah.
It does not need to descend into succession in order to, complete its experience. It's all what it is, and it's all what it knows.
Yeah.
So this is a way of saying that. Let's put it this way: when I die, when Charles Upton dies, does he turn into somebody else, or is there the same being who is Charles Upton and puts on a new body in the next world or in the next life? And it really doesn't stand to reason, because there's only one me, and whoever the next lifetime will be is going to be somebody else. It's not going to be, I turned into somebody else. I am me, and that person is someone else. We may have an affinity because we have, a similar spiritual destiny, or emanating from the same archetype or something like that. Mm-hmm. But really, what I'm saying is the belief in time travel comes from our inability to conceive eternity. If we understood what eternity was, we wouldn't have to say, well, there's got to be reincarnation, because I know I don't die somehow, but what could life be but another life on this planet or some other planet? We can't imagine a life that is in higher realms, because, as I say, the intermediary planes, the higher planes of the great chain of being, have disappeared for us largely. We can't conceive of those anymore. I mean, we could conceive them more easily when I was a child. I mean, just people who weren't into metaphysics at all could imagine God's in heaven and the angels are there and this and that, and we just don't. Now we don't imagine that anymore. We look up and say, "What's up there, angels?" No, the global positioning system is up there, or So it changed so much. But so I mean, time travel is absurd. I hate to say that, but physicists say could we go back? You had to have been there to go back there. Because who are you going to be when you go back there but somebody who's there? It's almost too, it's one of those things that's very hard to debunk, because it's so absurd that people haven't thought of arguments against it. yet, because it used to be just considered to be that doesn't happen. You know, I mean, time, like I said somewhere in the book, if we're ever going to travel back into the past, then we already have. Because, you know, in the future we will learn how to travel back into the past, and so we already have. And so where is everybody who's supposed to be coming in from the future? And then some people say, well, that's what the UFOs are. But really, nothing can move from one place. And like I said somewhere in the book, in terms of time travel, it is not like saying, well, is it possible for me to travel from Spain to Germany? It's more like saying, is it possible for Spain to travel to Germany? You know, we are entirely of this time. You know, this time is our quality, because different times have different qualities. And I can just see that, you know, having lived for almost 60 years, times have vastly different qualities. And there's no room in the past for any one of us to go back there unless we were already there. We would have to assume one of the states, one of the beings that was already there. Otherwise, infinitely absurd consequences develop. It's more interesting to ask, why would people start to begin to believe that you could do time travel? We cannot conceive of eternity, and yet we feel the time is ending.
Yeah.
And so, you know, this is our explanation. This is, well, and a lot of it has to do with, well, gee, you know, if time is going to end, if the world's going to end, I want to get out of here, and where can I go but back?
Yeah.
You know, let's get out of here. Let's run. Let's go back to Leave It to Beaver, where things aren't so crazy. You know, I mean, a lot of it just comes from that psychological need, and the inability to conceive that there is a reality beyond this level of things. So we just go into this feedback loop, imagining we can go back in time or run around in time, and it's not going to happen.
Now, I don't really quite understand your argument against time travel in the sense where you say that you'd have to be there. Because isn't the idea of time travel is you just go back there, you know, in a car or whatever, like Back to the Future or whatever, you know, and you just get out and you're there. Why do you have to be there in the past to go there?
Well, it's like you have to be there because that is the only space you can occupy. You can only, you know, in other words, you couldn't go to San Francisco from New York if there were no San Francisco, right? And
yeah.
By the same token, you couldn't go back to another place and be someone else unless that person was already there for you to be. And if that person was already there for you to be, then you and he are essentially one. And if you're one, there's no question of travel between you, you know, between one to the other.
Well, you state in the book that the unseen warfare hypothesis is infinitely better explanation than evolution as far as UFOs go. So let's extrapolate on that a little bit. Why do you think that it's more likely that there's an unseen warfare going on than just that, you know, the UFOs are here to elevate our evolution, if you will, or speed it up?
I mean, how are they elevating our evolution? I mean, this is something that Jacques Vallée, whom I very much respect, said in one of his, you know, that trilogy of books. I see no evidence that this has to do with our evolving to a higher physical state or a higher state of consciousness. What happens is we've become so materialistic, we've forgotten the reality of higher worlds, and we've forgotten the reality of God largely. Because of this, the jinn or the fairies from that plane can come through and they can amaze us. Because we're so materialistic, we can't believe that such things could happen. And essentially, all I see coming from that phenomenon is confusion. A lot of it is an attempt to deny the reality of the higher worlds that's always been brought forth by all the revealed religions. If you look into the teachings of the extraterrestrials, you will just see a great attack on religion. They want to be worshipped. And in earlier times, they would do that kind of thing, and people say, oh, that's just the fairies. Don't trust them. Fairies are weird.
Yeah.
Or they'd say, that's demonic. You know, don't get near that. But now, since we've lost the sense that these other worlds exist, they can come back and say, well, we are the angels. Or, actually, how did life begin on Earth? Well, we seeded you here. We are your creators. You see these... You know, which is an absurd idea. People talk about panspermia, you know, the idea that life was seeded here from other planets, and they make that a kind of explanation to to deal with the contradictions which are progressively emerging in the theory of evolution. So they say, well, if life couldn't have evolved on Earth, it must have come here from somewhere else, which is, of course, a materialistic interpretation of traditional idea of creation. And so it was seeded here by flying saucers. But the question is, where did the flying saucers get the DNA? On what planet did it evolve for them to get it and bring it here? And that question is never addressed. So, in other words, a number of absurd and anti-religious theories grow up around the UFO phenomenon that seem directly designed to deny the doctrines of all the world religions. And that's why, another reason why I say that these beings are largely demonic.
You take a pretty critical look at the Spielberg works, especially Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and you say how it acts as propaganda or mind control.
Well, yeah, what is that series that he did? We just saw that, we rented that, and I forget the name.
Oh, Taken.
Yeah, Taken, right. And look, I mean, if you want something, if you imagine somebody says, now, Stephen, what we want is something that will destroy people's belief in God, belief in the significance of human life, because we want to break down society and to turn it into a mass of chaos that we can mold to our own ends. I mean, I cannot think of a better job than what Spielberg did in Taken. I mean, that's what it is. It's so nihilistic. It's so hopeless, and it goes to no real end.
And do you think that goes beyond just creative license and more?
I don't know. I really don't know. I'm just saying, see, this is the point where paranoia rears its head. And paranoia is discerning an agenda and then putting it on the wrong level. I mean, it is possible that some of the social engineers came to Spielberg and said, okay, we need somebody to spread these ideas, and, this is your general, we'll fund you a bit, and here's your general script, but you fill in the details, according to your creative license. This could have happened, but there's no necessity that would have happened, because the demonic forces that are working to destroy this world and essentially to deconstruct the human form, which is what they want to do, could just as easily inspire somebody like Spielberg without the intermediary of the CIA or anybody else. Mm-hmm. So there's no way of knowing. So, it would be paranoid of me to roundly assert that Spielberg must be an agent, because I have no evidence of that, except, by their fruits you shall know them, but also by their fruits you shall know people who are inspired by, psychic influences that are far from healthy and are opposed to God. And there are plenty of people like that. It would be all of us if we don't watch out.
Yeah.
Well,
and now you also have a pretty scathing critique of Dr. Mack's work, Dr. John Mack. And I went on his website years ago and I saw that he was portraying himself, that he parachuted into some country, I forget where, he portrayed himself as working for the CIA as a sort of a stringer or a Lawrence of Arabia or cowboy diplomat, It was a very strange picture he gave of himself. I'm not a mere psychiatrist, he says. Anyway, I don't know about that. I don't know anything about his background other than his Harvard psychiatrist persona, although he did write a book and win a Pulitzer, didn't he, on T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, who actually did work for British intelligence. But anyway, Mack, people come traumatized, destroyed to John Mack. And what he says is, let's accept your horrible life-destroying experience as actually a positive thing. And, after all, it's the weirdest thing that ever happened to you, so there's got to be something good about it, right? Because it better be. And he says somewhere that, in his psychiatric sessions with people who have been abducted or believe they have, he said, our sessions were somehow the missing second half of the experience, or at least either he said that or that was my characterization of it. And it's terrible what these people would need in any normal spiritual culture, and all normal cultures are based upon spiritual revelations.
what people would say is something terrible has happened to you. You need protection from these beings. You know, go here, pray, fast. We'll pray for you. You know, don't think about them. Do something else. You know, and you know, pray to God to heal you from the terrible effects of these beings, which include physical illnesses, psychological breakdown, breakup of families. You know, just he comes up with this horrible list of symptoms that come from UFO abduction experiences, and then he turns around and says, but in a larger sense, they're good. You know, and only a complete nihilist, if not a Satanist, would say something like that. I mean, based upon his own stories, his own research about what these phenomena are like, then he turns around and says they're good. Unbelievable. So what the way he gets power over the people who come to him traumatized is not by saying, we have to protect you against these terrible beings that have walked into your room and taken you away, and, you know, and in some craft and probed you horribly and done whatever they did to you, or raped you in your sleep, or whatever they did. We're not going to protect you against them. We're going to protect you against your skeptical relatives and friends who think you're crazy. Don't worry, I believe you, you see, he says. And that's how he steps in and totally diverts whatever would be a normal reaction on their part as help. You know, save me from these horrible things. He gets them by saying, I believe you, because so many people don't believe him.
I'm moderately uncomfortable, I guess, critiquing the work of Mack in the sense that he's not around really to defend his research.
Well, he's not around to sue either, so.
Well, that's true, but,
right.
You know, it's kind of unfair because he's not really here to defend. Do you extend this critique to
anyone can go to his book and called Abduction. I think it's Abduction, not Abductions, but it's one or the other, and read it. And if you disagree with me, get back to me and tell me I'm wrong. But that's my impression of that book. It's a very destructive book.
But now my question is, would you extend that critique overall to the overall abduction research? I mean, is this just limited to John Mack's work, or
I haven't, and I wouldn't do that because I read Mack's book and that was horrible enough, and I don't want to read any more, to tell you the truth. So. You know, I'm sure there are very conscientious and, you know, intellectually curious people in that field who really want to know what the phenomenon is, and some of them hope they can learn more about it through hypnotic regression and things like this, which is, of course, a very debatable tool. I mean, there was a period where a lot of that kind of testimony was allowed in court, and then such, you know, strange consequences happened that finally it was disallowed, the last I heard. I'm not sure where it is right now. But yeah, there are probably some very conscientious researchers who've turned out some interesting stuff. I'm just saying that Mack more or less revealed the dark side of the abduction phenomenon, not just the horror of the phenomenon itself, but the horror of his inability to say it's evil, and his embracing of it simply because it exists and it's deeply weird.
Yeah.
And there are an awful lot of people like that nowadays who embrace something because it's deeply weird. They cannot conceive of absolute reality as good. Absolute reality, that's only just Pollyanna, you know. How could absolute reality be good? Absolute reality is weird. Because life is weird, you know, and this is the way people think now. And this has certainly radically changed into my lifetime. We used to believe absolute reality, God is good. What else could? Because good is real. And evil is a distortion of reality and a distortion of good. We no longer feel that. We no longer believe that.
Yeah. You know, because I just feel like critiquing Mack's work, because it's like dead research at this point. You can't really get any feedback to it. I'd like to see you take a critique to, you know, someone else who's doing the abduction research, like a Bud Hawkins, or David Jacobs is more in line with what you're saying. So, I mean, maybe you could look into that kind of thing.
Well, yeah. I mean, I might do that if I'm lured by programs like this back into the UFO field. I essentially got back into it again because I heard what Edgar Mitchell was saying, and I started to send down little emails around, you know, trying to say, don't necessarily believe this guy.
Yeah, because you're coming out against the UFOs, and you seem to think that this is sort of reaching ahead, if you will, where we're looking at the potential for an Armageddon situation, Revelations, Antichrist scenario. Was that right?
Well, yeah, this is basically what Seraphim Rose, very interesting figure, by the way. He was Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox priest, an American who died when? The 70s, I think. I may be wrong. But he wrote a book called Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future, and a lot of problems with that book because he was, gets into this thing that the Eastern Orthodox get into where they are too anti-Catholic and they make that too much of their argument. But his chapter on UFOs was great. I mean, he's the one that really showed how the various things that are attributed to UFOs and to alien abductions and such can all be found in the lives of the saints in the Eastern Orthodox literature having to do with the saints' experience of demons. Very much the same stuff.
So where do you think this is all headed? You're laying out a scenario here where the UFOs are the occupants, let's say, of the UFOs. They're sort of orchestrating a push for man to move away from religion and the true God, as you say, and therefore, to be remolded into a satanic society. Is that where you're kind of saying this is going?
I think if one is capable, first, if one believes that there is such a thing as the satanic, and if one is willing to look at what's actually happening in society, I think there are many evidences of that in every field. And I think the UFOs are part of that. So the question is, this seems rather depressing. What is the value? A lot of people say if it's too terrible to contemplate and we can't do anything about it anyway, why talk about it? And my answer is, it's possible to protect yourself individually from influences of psychic forces such as UFO aliens, and that we should learn how to do it, and learn that what they're doing is they're struggling to abduct our spiritual attention, our basic spiritual attention and belief, and turn it in their direction and away from God. So what we need to know in order to combat them in a real way, not to make them go away from the skies, but to prevent them from having the ultimate effect upon us, which is to cause us to lose our souls, we have to learn to reestablish our deep and innate conception of the reality of God and the goodness of God. And beyond that, there are other, protective elements, protective practices that even include exorcism and things like that we can use to protect ourselves and to heal ourselves from this kind of contact. But it's very hard to conceive of the evil of these things, because if you really come to an understanding or belief that they are that evil, then you will look around to the rest of society and say, but they're not alone. There's plenty of things that are having the same kind of effect on us. I mean, this world society is going to hell.
Yeah.
Incredible. I mean, if anybody would just have to go back 10 years, or somebody brought forward, we're talking about time travel from 10 years ago, and look at television now and they say, what? How could this have happened? It's, continuous, endless destruction of human dignity.
But that couldn't happen because, as you pointed out, time travel is not possible.
Well, it couldn't happen. But I can remember, the way things were 10 years ago, and bring myself forward and be freaked. So look at television. It isn't just a continuous, and of course the internet. It isn't just a continuous line of the paranormal, the demonic, evil robots. All these new programs, Fringe just came out, not to mention the X-Files, all, endless train of this. But two other aspects, so we're getting a little away from UFOs here, but two other aspects are, number one, we're being taught to have no human dignity, which is why you have a program where overweight people dressed in strange outfits jump off of large rubber balls and fall into pools full of muck, and this is entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
Or Prison Break, we're all in prison, or the cop shows, we're all criminals. This is all being done in order to destroy our self-respect, because when the destruction of our freedoms comes along, as it has with the Patriot Act and other things, if we have no self-respect, we will not feel we have a right to protest. So, if you just look at the image of humanity presented by the mass media, humanity is an ape that has no rights, deserves to be locked up, and if he's lucky, he'll be kept fed with bananas, and that's about it. So, the UFO phenomenon is only one way of looking at the destruction of the society and the destruction of the human form. We're trying to deconstruct the human form with genetic engineering or whatever else, or making beings that are half human and half ape through gene splicing and all of this. Destroy the human form. And why do we destroy the human form? Why does the devil want the human form destroyed? Because the human form is, as it says in Genesis, we are the stewards of this creation. As it says in the Quran, God offered the trust to the heavens and the earth and the hills, and they shrank from it. They were afraid of it, and man assumed it. Then it says, lo, he hath proved a tyrant and a fool. But we are the telos of this plane of existence. We're the reason for the whole thing. Even if you want to talk about evolution, which I don't believe in Darwinian evolution. I believe in the change of forms of life, but not through the natural selection of random mutations, which does not explain it. But, let's say it was all tended to us. As what it says in Genesis, we were created last. And so we were sort of the purpose and the summing up of this whole thing. And, but why? If we're just an animal or just, a biotechnological device created by aliens, a genetic experiment created by these horrible beings from other planets, what rights do we have? Why are we here? What's human life for? And if we keep saying what's human life for, we will not meet the human mandate. We will not cherish and seek to attain the fullness of the human form. What we will do is let ourselves sink into the infrapsychic and the subhuman level, and through basically vices and sins and lack of any kind of self-respect. And this is what Satan wants, because he wants souls. And he doesn't have a lot of time to harvest these souls, so he's putting out his full effort at this point, I would say.
Why doesn't he have enough time?
Because the world's about to end.
And what makes you say that? Just based on past religious doctrines and what have you?
Well, I mean, or based upon what scientists tell us, based upon any number of things. Now, it could go on for 20,000 years. It could go on for 20 years. I mean, nobody would be surprised if the ecosystem cracked in 20 years, or it could go on. We don't know. But, this is a point where, although what science tells us is on one level and what the scriptures of all the religions tell us is on another level, and there are levels that the scriptures tell us that science can't touch, yet there is a certain convergence between them. And it simply means that we're going to have to deal with the fact that we're living in end times. And you don't deal with that by saying, well, when's the world going to end? Is it going to be in 10 years, or do we have maybe 100 years? And that's not exactly it. But we look at the quality of degeneration, the quality of chaos and loss of form that is developing in this world, and we, number one, are going to have to do everything we can, our level best, to protect ourselves from these influences. And that's saving the world. God, if you can save your soul from the destruction that is coming through every porthole, through every crack in everything, that's a great task, and that's a worthy task. And beyond that, there may be certain values that can be expressed in times like these that never could before. I mean, there are old saints from the Desert Fathers in Syria and Egypt. I forget, one of these is Abba Moises. I forget exactly where he was, but he was one of those Desert Fathers. And somebody came to him and said, one of the monks was having problems with, sexual fantasies or whatever, sexual sins, and he was saying, well, how do I deal with this? I feel so weak, against this kind of temptation, and does it ever end? And Abba Moises said, well, probably 10 or 12 days after you're in the ground, I am told, when it ends. And somehow they were talking, and the monk says, well, what will it be like really when we get to the latter days, And he says, in the latter days, Abba Moises says, people will be weaker than we are, and they won't be able to fast even one day hardly, and they won't be able to fulfill their spiritual duties, and they'll just be, weak and won't have the strength that we have.
Yeah.
But he also said, but they will be better than we are. And the monk says, well, why is this? How could, if they're so weak? Well, they will have the great honor of being able to fight Satan hand to hand, directly, face to face.
Nice, I like that.
And I think that's what's going on now. And there's something that comes, that we're able to offer to God, some value that we're struggling to create that we can offer to our Creator that could not be offered in any other time. It's like they say war brings out the best and the worst in people. Well, I think that's what's happening now, and that the state of this world is bringing out the best and the worst in people, and we have to learn how to use it so that it brings out the best in us and not the worst. And, that's the larger context in which the UFO phenomenon has to be viewed. If we can see what's wrong, what's evil about those entities, we will learn an awful lot about other things.
To try and bring it back to a little more materialistic perspective, just to sort of nail it down a little bit, where do you see what's going on here with UFOs headed? Do you think we're getting to a point now where they're going to be openly accepted by people? It seems like
there's a big push that among apparently the powers that be, that UFOs be accepted as a reality, and exactly how this is going to be used by the powers that be to further sap our moral fiber, which I'm sure it will. I don't know. We'll have to watch. But it's very interesting that Mitchell comes out and says what he says. Well, it's common knowledge. We all know that they're real, and the government's in touch with them. Okay, that's one thing. At the same time, the Vatican, not the same time, a little bit earlier, the Vatican astronomer comes out and says, okay, for Catholics to believe in UFOs and ETs, because God is universal and great and Catholic, and so now this has been something that was asserted a long time ago, but it came out as if it were in concert with Mitchell's statement, and then you have that hour and a half on ABC that came out recently, which was an interesting overview, covered most of the bases, didn't seem to be a big propaganda work in itself, or a mind control work, but yet there it was saying, this is a phenomenon we have to deal with, and Larry King, and it's getting closer. And there's this disclosure project, which I have not been following. I just know that it exists, and that they're hoping that finally the government will twist the government's arm, and it'll finally say, oh, okay, we'll break down and say, yeah, we know about it.
Yeah.
And of course, if the ufologists and the UFO believers believe that they have exerted so much pressure to force the government out of its stance of denying UFOs and to finally break down and admit they're real, then it'll be very hard for them to believe that that's exactly what the government wants.
Oh, absolutely. You can be sure bet that no matter what the government says, the UFO groups won't believe it anyway. So. Well,
but what if the government finally says, you got us? Yeah, we try to hide it, but I guess you're too smart for us. You're too powerful for us, and we now will admit that here's the evidence. And an awful lot of UFO groups will go for that. They'd say, we won. But what if this was all staged to begin with, and that's the final outcome that the government, or whoever we're calling the government for this purpose, wanted all along? Because one of the things that Jacques Vallée said in Messengers of Deception, that someone he talked to said that after World War II, the military circles that this person traveled in were talking about, if only we could create the idea of a common enemy from beyond this planet, we could unify the Earth politically against this outside enemy.
Yeah.
And that was being talked about way back then. So, whether that's exactly the outcome that everybody who's perpetrating this deception upon us, and not a deception that the phenomenon is real. The phenomenon is real, but the propagandistic use of a real phenomenon in order to foster certain ideas, do they want it's all pointing essentially toward a one world government.
Yeah.
And I think this is one of the what belief in UFOs does, it breaks down other loyalties. As you can see through the Spielberg material, it breaks down loyalties in families. As you can see in terms of the kind of doctrines the UFOs are supposed to be, the ETs are supposed to be teaching us, it breaks down loyalty to religion. It's breaking down the various estates of human society that would stand against a one world government. and it's doing quite a good job.
No, I'm going to play devil's advocate, I guess, for lack of a better term. No pun intended. But what?
No, and I wouldn't ever imply that.
But what about the perspective, just that there's God and He's in His heaven, and there's Earth here, and there's other planets that God made. He's got other things going on. He's multitasking. He's made 4 or 5 Earths.
And of course, I'm not denying that. There could be intelligent life on other planets. That's something I'm glad we brought out. There certainly could be. It just looks like these beings don't look like they're from around here in terms of material reality. They don't have a quality of material reality. They're too ephemeral. They fit the profile much more of beings from the intermediary plane, fairies and the jinn and demons, than they do spaceships.
Okay.
And if we know that there is a criterion for a definition of that kind of reality, we'll see that they're a lot closer to that than they are nuts and bolts spaceships coming from somewhere else. It is not to say that there couldn't be life on other planets, intelligent life. There might well be. I don't know about that. But what Jacques Vallée determined, he just said, if you just take the most convincing and inexplicable apparitions of UFOs, which is maybe 5% or something of the whole number, there are simply too many of them for these to be coming from other planets.
Yeah,
we'd have to be in the middle of a freeway here. They act much more like they are beings that have to do with our world, but are usually not visible, because there are too many of them to be coming from other planets. Why are people from all planets universe coming here right now?
Yeah.
It just doesn't stand to reason.
Okay, yeah. I'm a big believer in the option E, all of the above, as far as UFOs go. So I'm not in conflict with your thoughts here. But
okay.
Another devil's advocate idea here that I have with regards to your stuff, and I really enjoyed your work, and I found it pretty fascinating. But a lot of this stuff is based on the metaphysics of these previous researchers and philosophers and stuff from way back when. But we're sort of living in a different time as far as science goes and stuff like that. And maybe, the ideas of these guys are outdated in the sense that, the hierarchy of being and that kind of thing doesn't fly, I guess, with what we know nowadays. Does that make any sense?
Well, yeah, and a lot of people believe exactly that. And this introduces the concept known as scientism. Now, material science in our time has, without doubt, discovered more about material reality and its subtleties and how to manipulate it and possibly its origin up to a certain point than anybody ever has. And it's so impressive. We have impressed ourselves so much with what we've been able to learn about nature that we've developed an ideology around it called scientism, which, without any real reason to say this, without without any basis for such an assertion, will say whatever science cannot understand or does not accept as existing or is not interested in looking at, none of that exists.
Yeah.
Now, as Houston Smith said about that, he said, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Mm-hmm. And, of course, scientism or science is not going to turn up evidence of things it's not looking for. It started out with Newton and mechanics. And during Newton's time, people suddenly believed that the laws of mechanics were the way to look into the mind of God. Now we see how God created the universe is through these laws of motion. Well, we've gone way beyond that, but we've gone on the same materialistic plane. And essentially, we cannot say that the human race have been fools from day one until maybe 300 years ago. It just isn't possible. Earlier civilizations spent more time attending to levels of being higher on the great chain of being, and so knew more about them. Spent less time and had less resources to attend to the material plane, and so knew less about them, less about the material plane.
Yeah.
But basically, you cannot say that all those old philosophies were simply foolish attempts to explain things that Newton and Einstein and later were able to elucidate. They were talking about something else, entirely different.
Okay. if we're going to be under siege by demons and what have you, and you know, in this, is God going to bail us out? I guess that's the bottom line question. Is God going to bail us out?
Very timely. Very timely.
Because I kind of feel, in a way, too, you know, you're kind of tough on the human race here in the book, but in my perspective, I kind of feel like they've been led astray by people that they entrusted to take care of them.
Yes, this is true. This is true. And you know, the people that we turn to used to have been priests, not to say that priests don't have problems of their own, otherwise there wouldn't have been a pedophilia scandal, or before that a Protestant Reformation, but, you know, the more normal, in terms of the entire history of the human race, the more normal setup of society, when there started to be social classes and castes, was that the people who contemplated the eternal realities were more or less at the top. And yeah, those people became corrupt. And then they were ousted by people from the lower castes. I mean, Guénon talks about how the time when the priests were essentially, there was a revolution of the warriors against the priests, and then the warriors ran things. Mm-hmm. And now we're getting to where, I'm not even sure, pretty soon we won't believe the scientists anymore either, you know.
That day's coming pretty fast.
But right now, you know, the scientists, we still turn to them for asking. We ask what's going to happen, what can we do about it. We turn to the scientists, and you know, that they can answer a question on the nuts and bolts level of how, but they cannot answer questions like why.
Yeah.
In the ultimate sense. And so, is God going to bail us out? Well, according to the scriptures of every religion I've seen, you have to say yes and no. What happens is things get to the worst possible path. And, you know, like in the book of the Apocalypse. And then the new revelation from God comes. And this is called, you know, in Christianity, the second coming of Christ, or, you know, the word faithful and true who rides on the white horse, who's identified with Christ. And also in Islam, Jesus, the prophet Jesus, returns and slays the Antichrist. People don't know that about Islam. There's more material about the Antichrist in Islam than there is in Christianity. This is what's called the Kalki Avatara in Hinduism, or Maitreya in Buddhism. And essentially, things get as bad as they can get, and then God intervenes. What we don't know is whether this world as we know it survives, you know, pulls through, somehow we can pick up the pieces, or whether it is essentially annihilated, and as it says in the Apocalypse, then you have a new heaven and a new earth, for the old heaven and the old earth passed away. We don't know exactly, you know, what will be left of what we know as the earth by the time this whole process completes itself. But what we do know is we're being given an exquisite opportunity to choose between evil and illusion on the one hand, and the direct intervention of the power and love and truth of God on the other hand.
Yeah.
And that's it. And we got to choose, because we're looking at this big drama, but you know, a single human life is so short anyway that, you know, ultimately we have to also say, well, the earth is mortal. Even if we pull through this time around, the sun will burn out someday. It's not going to last forever. The earth is mortal, but the soul is immortal. And what is immortal deserves greater care and greater dedication than what is mortal. What is mortal is here in order to give us an environment in which we can make choices that will affect the immortal and our state in eternity. So that's the basic religious view. And it really isn't any different when Apocalypse comes around. It's just, Apocalypse just sharpens everything, makes it clearer for those who, it may have been a little hazing on it. But, you know, it's the same thing. You know, you've got to save your soul, because that's why we're here. We're put into this world of immensely different kinds of influences. And, you know, you build your soul, as it were, according to the influences that you accept and the ones you reject. And we got a certain amount of time to do this. And how our soul is by the time we come to the end of our lives determines the next phase of things. And that's why we're here.
Yeah. Now, in the book, you talk about how the aliens, they're like the jinn, and they're kind of like demonic, but there's also some good jinn. Are they sort of offsetting the evil ones?
I hope so. I mean,
don't we all?
Yeah, they may well be. I undoubtedly, in fact, answering that question, I would refer you to The Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings is probably this, in a certain sense, the story of these apocalyptic times seen from the standpoint of the intermediary plane. And I'm not saying that everything that happens in The Lord of the Rings is really going on, but it shows you the quality of the war of light against darkness as it happens in that subtle world.
Yeah.
So I think that is probably going on. But the question is, can we ally with the Jinn? I mean, the hippies believed we could ally with the good fairies against the bad technology. And a lot of them got that from reading The Lord of the Rings. They didn't see that as a Christian allegory, which is what Tolkien meant it to be. They saw it as a neo-pagan allegory, and it had a bigger influence in expanding neo-paganism than in adding something to Christianity. But I think what I learned when I tried to do that in the olden days was that we really cannot ally with them. They're fighting their own battle on their own plane. In fact, there was a Sufi saint, a Muslim saint, who, when he would pray, the Muslim jinn, the good jinn, would come and pray next to him. And he would politely ask them, could you please go and pray somewhere else? Not because he thought they were evil, but because they're terribly distracting.
Yeah.
I mean, we have our own human function and our own human duty, and dallying around with a jinn, even the nice jinn, can sort of jinnify us in a strange way. It makes us feel, I look at these people doing extreme sports, and I'm saying they're almost trying to turn into they're trying to fly. They're trying to turn into fairies or the jinn, or ride on magic carpets or magic motorcycles, and there's that tendency, because the jinn can really energize you, but they turn you sort of into a, this term pixelated. You ever hear that word?
Yeah.
Yeah, it means pixie-led, and you just get elvish, and it's not a good idea to become elvish. We need to be human, and this is one of the big things we're forgetting, and what the evil jinn are trying to get us to forget, because we'd be fascinated with all these magics and psychic powers, and forget the basic work of overcoming the darkness in our souls, overcoming vice, building virtue, following God's will as we understand it and as it has been revealed to us. And we get too excited about all those magic powers, we will forget the main point.
But what about the idea that the magic powers, for lack of a better term, like psychic abilities and stuff, are inherently plausible in people, but that it's been drowned out of them by society and the way people...
That's a half-truth. I think there's some truth to that. I just think that a time in which those psychic powers could be well used by the general run of humanity is more or less past. It's true that in various traditions, saints will develop those powers, but they will not develop them because they're seeking them. They'll develop them as a byproduct of seeking God. And it's essentially God who uses those powers, not me. So that's another way to look at them. But I think if psychic powers develop, it's not necessarily evil, but it's never a good idea to want to develop psychic powers, because that's not your job. Your job is to be a better person.
I'll keep that in mind.
Okay. Well.
Is there anything else you'd like to talk about that we haven't touched on, you think?
Not that I can think of.
We've kind of hit on most of the big points here.
Yeah, and we finally got to putting the UFO phenomenon in the eschatological context, which, I would try to do in my book. And actually, Cracks in the Great Wall is mostly part of a larger book called The System of Antichrist, Truth and Falsehood in Postmodernism and the New Age. And so the last thing is buy my book, which you can get through Amazon or Barnes & Noble.
There you go. Well, I have one more question for you. And this kind of springs out of what we've been talking about, too. It's not really in the notes. As we've kind of been talking about, you think that the society is being molded and shaped on evil intents, if you will. But do you think that the people, the actual humans that are sort of pulling the strings, do you think that they know that they're in service of Satan, if you will?
Oh, that's a great question. Most of them do not.
So they just think that they're doing it for the best or something?
A few of them do. Most of them do not. That's the short answer.
Okay. Do you want to extrapolate on that a little more? What the people who do, they're just Satanists? Is that how it works? And the ones
Some of them actually are. And I believe that. I think But there are an awful lot of people who, from my point of view, would look like Satanists because of what they do, and actually that's not their view of themselves at all. They're just, running your regular realpolitik, power motive with as much social control and propaganda thrown in that they think they need. I mean, most of our masters are simply, like politicians or people have always been who want power, economic power.
So they're as duped as the rest of us, those.
Most people are duped, but I think there's some people who got to a place where they ultimately are worshiping Satan, because that's one of the possibilities. That's something we look at Satanists as, very fringy people who are like, serial killers or like to do horrible things or have weird cults where they.
No, but they're usually pretty normal people on the outside.
Yeah, but the idea that Satanism could be an element of the power elite is something that, and I know there's a great bibliography, if I knew it, I could give you about that. There's one, what is an Age for Satan? I forget who wrote that, but he was just discovering, I forget his name, but he was studying these cults, satanic cults, and he was finding that, wait a minute, he's running into people who are very, influential and very powerful in the world who were associated with these cults, and he had no religious belief, and so he was going to just, be a cult, do cult exposés, but he was so overawed by the darkness in these cults that he almost said, well, gee, maybe they're real. If it's real, maybe that's the way things are. Maybe that's the way life is. Maybe it is evil. He didn't have a religious faith to tell him not to do that. But there is a tendency. I don't know what groups or individuals are involved, but a lot of, or some of the power elites, I'm convinced, are involved in what's called Luciferianism. That's what I call it anyway. Other people do. And it's a false metaphysic where you sort of distribute the idea of the food chain to the entirety of existence. Everything is predatory. The way you rise spiritually is by, feeding on those who are lesser than you and rebelling against and taking over the position of those who are higher than you. And so it's like a satanic vision of the great chain of being. The great chain of being is God's self-manifestation down through these layer upon layer of existence, like waves of light and truth coming out from him and manifesting on all these different levels. But the Luciferians look at it as a kind of food chain where it's all predatory, it's all evil, and what they ultimately want to do is they think God is like a king or like a president who just happens to be in that position of power, but they're going to knock him out of the box.
Yeah.
They're going to eat their way up the food chain until they finally are able to kill God and become him. And some people actually do believe that, and that becomes their operative paradigm for everything they do.
Well, that's spooky.
Yeah, it is spooky. It is indeed. If you want to see a movie of that, look at The Devil's Advocate with Al Pacino.
Yeah.
I think that was a little look into the Luciferian world of New York.
Well, I'll agree that New York is pretty Luciferian since I'm from Boston, so I'm all on board.
Oh, you're cool. Boston. Catholics, some of them are pretty weird.
Well, we do what we can.
Bernard Law should be in jail, not in the Vatican. Anyway.
That's for sure. It's been an enlightening conversation. What's next for you? What do you have planned? Future books? What kind of stuff you got planned in that regard?
I got a whole bunch of books that came out this year because I'm luckily working with this publisher who is a one-man operation, so he publishes all the books he can, although they're all pretty good, if I do say so myself. And I've got a book called, I shied a bit away from looking at the dark side because you can't do that every year,
Yeah.
So I did a book called Knowings in the Arts of Metaphysics, Cosmology, and the Spiritual Path, which I just wrote enough of metaphysical essays and actually a fable, and that finally got to be book length. So there was that. There's a book on Sufism called Reflections of Tasawwuf. There's a book that I wrote some years ago, most of it called Who is the Earth? How to See God in the Natural World. There's a book called Shadow of the Rose, The Esoterism of the Romantic Tradition, where I'm looking at, having been a poet earlier in life and being descended from Guillaume de Poitiers, who was the first troubadour, and in Sufism, like in the poetry of Rumi and such, there's a lot of that spiritual romance. So I did something on the romantic tradition as it appears in Christianity and Islam and elsewhere. So that's Shadow of the Rose. And the last book I did was called Folk, because I moved to Kentucky 4 years ago from California. So I got into this folk world where, you get state grants to do folk stuff.
Yeah.
So I wrote a book called Folk Metaphysics, Mystical Meanings in Traditional Folk Songs and Spirituals. Which
Interesting.
was fun, and it somehow all this metaphysical lore that didn't fit in anywhere else, somehow when I was doing exegeses of these songs like The Lady Gay and Scarborough Fair and things like that, I just filled in all this metaphysical lore that seemed to be suggested by those songs, because some people who wrote those songs knew exactly what they were doing, and once in a while, pretty rarely, once in a while you get a traditional ballad that is a strict essay in metaphysics.
Wow.
They were maybe done by the Christian Hermeticists or something, like one is called Fair Nottingham Town. It's all alchemical symbolism. So that was interesting to see,
Nice. And you got a website or anything that people can check out? What do you suggest how people check out more of your work? Through Amazon?
I guess they can go back to oldserioussseekers.com, which hasn't been updated in years but is still alive, and they can get an interview by me. It doesn't have my new books.
Okay.
So, and unfortunately, the website of our press is so ambitious that it's taking forever to develop. And press is Sophia Perennis, SOPhiaPerennis.com. And you go in there, and you either soon you'll be able to see the new website, but right now SophiaPerennis.com will take you to the old website, which has a few of my books, but not all the ones I'm talking about here.
Okay, but it's going to be up and running soon, you think?
Yeah, it'll hopefully, and we want to make it interactive. We came up, me and Marty Glass, who's another of the authors of Sophia Perennis, who wrote a wonderful book about the end times from a totally different perspective, very, entirely spiritual and coming from comparative religion and a lot of it from Hinduism, but also very humanistic, because this guy used to be a Marxist back when you could be an idealistic Marxist, and then of course he gave it up. But, really, talking to the man in the street about what it's like to live in these terrible times.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful book. It's called Yuga, An Anatomy of Our Fate. And anyway, he and I came up with two sets of questions. He did most of them, I did a few, and they came to the 80 questions altogether. And they're basically like just asking basic questions on the spiritual life, Like one is, are we living in a creation or just some kind of place? On that kind of level. And actually they cover most of the main points in metaphysics and the spiritual life, but in a very accessible way. They remind me of Studs Terkel or something,
Yeah.
Very, and what we want to do is make those available so people can answer them, and then, we'll choose the best answers, because we can't just put in everything, and archive them, and so people can go back and see what, the people are saying about metaphysics.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of wisdom out there that doesn't, that has no voice, and it may not even know what it knows until it starts expressing it. And we hope to serve the people who have that wisdom.
And that'll be on the new website when you get it up and running.
Yeah. So that'll be SophiaPerennis.com.
Awesome. Well, I'll keep an eye on that, and when it gets all up and running, we'll link up to it and everything.
Good.
Well, Charles, it's been great talking to you. I really appreciate you coming on the show. You bring a definitely unique perspective to this, aside from the usual ufologists that we have on the program. They sort of look at it from a different perspective. I really enjoy your metaphysical perspective. It's very deep. It's very thought-provoking stuff, and makes you take another look at the UFO phenomenon, what really may be going on here. So I can't thank you enough for coming on the show. I look forward to more of your works, and hopefully we'll be talking again in the future.
Well, hope so. Glad to have done it.